So, to show how Pivotools Clone UVs macro work, I've grabbed this art on the web, which is basically a fan art for the Ghosts and Ghosts main character, Lord Arthur, and I've just renamed it to something more suitable like Lord Arthritz. Okay, so basically my idea was to show how easily you could get an asset, just a regular 2D asset, and convert it into a separate parts character ready to be animated with RageTools inside Unity. So when you're using an art pre-pose like that, you may potentially run into some issues. Most specifically, the limb's length. It can definitely pose problems for you, because when you rotate this to be along the vertical axis, they will probably not be in their proper positions, or one leg might be shorter than the other. Okay, but definitely a good starting point in some cases. Nevertheless, most usually you want to have your character pre-positioned on the standing pose, just to make sure that the limb's lengths are equal from the left to the right side. Okay, the next step was bringing it to Illustrator. I set it as a template layer, the image, and I made sure the artboard size was exactly the same size of the art, in this case 512 by 512 pixels. This is also going to help us in the next steps. Now what I had to do was to simply trace over the shapes. So I just hit Ctrl Y on the keyboard to enable the preview mode inside Illustrator so that you can perfectly see the shapes that I've created. Right, so here you can see the hips, which is actually the parent of everything, and the right leg, which includes the right knee as its child, also the right foot, the right foot tip. Okay, and each of these parts has a pivot named shape as its child, as we saw in the first video, to make sure that it works with Pivotools branch. Notice that I have already arranged the nesting of the shapes and their ordering, so that, for instance, you have the left leg, this one here, behind the torso, the hips, and the chest in front of the hips, okay, and so on and so forth. This way, when I open it inside Unity, it's gonna be perfectly set and ready for animation, right? So what I had to do next was to separate these parts so that I could actually paint the parts. For instance, in this arm here, I had to be able to paint the part behind the torso, behind the chest. So to do it, I've simply duplicated this posed shape, okay, and then I moved it. I just zoom out a bit so you can see the whole canvas. So I simply moved these parts. So for instance, I've left the chest where it originally was, then I move it to the right, the arm. Okay, let me just hit Ctrl Y to make things simpler, right? So let me get out of isolation mode. So you can see that I've simply distributed those shapes around this bigger canvas, this bigger area, okay, to make things simpler for me, since I would have to move or to nudge the original texture so it was placed right behind these original splines. I've used a little trick. I came to Edit, Preferences, General, and I've set the keyboard increment to something large, like 100 pixels, to a very round value like this, so that when I nudge each of these shapes, for instance this guy here, if I hit right or left on the keyboard, you see that it moves this precise amount of 100 pixels, which I actually used the same amount inside Photoshop to nudge the textures. I've then exported this to PSD format, like so, and open it. It's right inside Photoshop. Then I basically nudged the texture parts simply using the selection tools, selection one area, and then moving it to the right, something like that. And of course I would increase the canvas first, the canvas size, so it actually has the same size of the new image, of the new imported image. And then I would use Shift and, for instance, right arrow, so it moves on multiples of 10 pixels. So if I've used 100 pixels offsets inside Illustrator, I would just click Shift right 10 times. So you get precisely 100 pixels movements. Okay, so I would just do that for every part using layers, etc. All the tool set inside Photoshop, and I use it clone stamp to fill in the formerly occluded parts of the bitmap, and so that I got a final texture ready to use inside Unity. Notice that I've added a dark gray background to the art so that you can actually have a more appropriate color for the bleeding area, if we can color like that, for the vector shapes. Pretty handy if you're changing the density of the curvature so some white background doesn't show up, since Photoshop would flatten this to a white color if you don't use a proper background bleeding color. Okay, so now let's see inside Unity how to assemble this all together. The first thing is obviously importing the art. I've just set a proper Z offset here, so shapes properly stack along the Z axis, and I've disabled midline controls just because I want to form the shape, so I won't need them. So let's just click import. A brief moment later, you see the art already imported, right? So as I've mentioned before, we have these suffixes added to the names whenever you have a replicated name. So for instance, within segmented, I have hips, and within posed, I have hips. So you end up having different suffixes numbered automatically by SVG, right? So of course, for our macro to properly match those names, they can't be different. So there's a new option within Rage Group. Let me just add Rage Group here. And if you right click, close with label, you see two new options. One of those, clean up names, which automatically clears this up for you, and UV fit, which can actually fit a texture size to the boundary of the whole spline group, right? But we won't need to use these options here because the macro will do them all for us. What we have to do is applying a proper Rage spline texture and style. So let's do this now. So to create a new Rage spline style, let's just pick any spline. Doesn't really matter which, but it makes your job easier if it's already a white spline. It's important that the fill color is set to white in the shape that you're going to create the style. Just set texturing mode to fill, and then type whatever name you want. Let's just type temp here and hit create. Now the style is created. It's going to be somewhere in your project list. If you can't find it, simply type it in the filter, select it, and clear out the filter, and it's going to keep selected. Okay, let's just make sure that we get the style setting out of the spline, which was the one we picked before. Just click here, click none, and it clears out the style. That's just so that it doesn't keep overriding whatever settings it's got here, which is actually what Rage Group does. It simply copies the style settings to the splines. It doesn't actually override the style, just for flexibility's sake. So now we'll just have a group here. So let's just go to RageTools, group, and just drag temp to the styles fold-out section. Okay, so now as soon as you hit apply styles, it's gonna copy the same settings for every spline in this group. The second step is applying a suitable material for all the splines in this group. Okay, just so you understand, you have Rage spline material here, and setting another shader here and manually assigning the texture would be too much work. So to prevent that, we'll simply duplicate an existing Rage spline material. In our case, we want textured one, so just type it here in the filter, select material textured, clear out the filter again. Now just duplicate it, just make sure I pick the right one. Okay, then I'll hit F2 to rename it, and I'll call this Lord Arthrit's material. Now I'll just move this over to where I have the other files for organization's sake. And I'll just set up the actual texture that's going to be applied using this shader. So I have already set the exported file from Photoshop. I simply exported it as a PNG. So I just drag it over here. And if I want, I'll set it up right inside here. So you see I have a max size of 512, the format's compressed, filter mode linear, no big deal actually, just a simple texture. Of course you can change this to your liking. So now that I have the material with the texture appropriately set, we want to apply this texture to all the Rage splines in this group. So let's select the group, the object that contains the group, and run the component, RageTools, macros, Rage group apply material macro. Just click it once and a small window will pop up. Then you select your just created material, drop in here, click process, and it's done. Of course, the texture is just assigned, but it's not fitting the entire size of the group. So to do that, like I said before, you can just select the Rage group label with the right mouse button and click UV fit. Actually, the macro that I'm going to show next does that for you, but it's always cool to just click here and see how things are. Notice how we already have the shapes of the segmented version, okay, properly fitting the texture just as we've created them. So the last step is simply to clone over or to copy over those texturing coordinates or UVs from the segmented object to the posed object, and that's what we're going to do now. Just select component, RageTools, macros, and select Rage Pivotools, Clone UVs. And this nice little window pops up. Now let's merely drag segmented to source. It's the guy where we're copying the UVs from. And let's assign posed to the target field. Notice that I didn't care about the suffixes because the macro is going to take care of them for us. Right? So I just leave everything checked. You can read about each option in the documentation, but you most usually will want them all checked. So just click process, and believe it or not, it's done. Yeah, let's just get rid of segmented because we don't need it anymore, and let's get rid of the small UV area background shape. And yeah, it's done like I said. So as soon as you clear out the clutter, you're gonna see that it's all ready for animation. You can already rotate each part. You can realize that it's in the exact order that you have created them, like I said before, and you can start to see if you should edit something. So for instance, I have just noticed that the beard of the head of the character is being occluded by the chest, and that's not what I want. In other solutions, you'd most probably have to edit this PNG, added the transparency to make sure it's no longer blocking out the beard of the character. But not here. With Rage Spline and RageTools, you can simply double click, add a new point, and just edit your mask in real time. Tell me this ain't cool. So yeah, basically you can do whatever you want in terms of defining your outline. And the cool thing with all that is that you can literally scale your art to whatever size you want, and the edges are gonna keep crisp clear. And definitely you can make this even better. Let's just assign edge tune so the edges never blur, and just hit snapshot, initialize. There's a little trick here. When you want to know what's the best auto density to use, just take a quick peek inside the member list and check what's the largest density that you can spot. In this case it's 8, so let's double it. Let's make this 16. Okay, so just snapshot, initialize, set this to live, and notice if we just hit on stats, you can see the try mount. And if I increase this, you can see that the curvature is getting more polygons. It's getting smoother. So if you scale it down, you will see how the triangle count goes down, which is perfect. To mobile devices, it automatically downsizes the amount of triangles used while keeping the perfect curvature as you're seeing here in your game view. One thing worth mentioning is that if I added the Lord Arthur's segmented art, I can reduce its size even more. And notice that the outlines remain perfect. Of course, it's not ideal for whatever is within the shapes, but the outlines, they keep perfectly clear. So depending on what you want to do and how much texture resolution you have, since our eyes detect much more easily the contours, especially when there's background scenery moving and other moving parts around, you can certainly save up lots of texture memory using this technique. And I did a very half job. Of course, I could have more parts that would hide those high contrast areas that are showing up here, and I could have an entire scenery all packed up in a single texture. You can literally create an entire game tile set in a single texture if you want. So lots of room to investigate, to play with, and to improve your game development tool set. Have fun with RageTools, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.